Okay, so hope everyone can hear me. We're going to get started. Good morning and thanks for joining us. During the next hour, we'll be providing information on the current effort underway at New York State Parks to produce the 2020 statewide Greenways plan and reviewing the associated draft scoping document. Before we get into the content of the plan and the scoping document, we'll just do a couple quick introductions so you know who's speaking. I'm Chris Morris. I'm the statewide trails planner for New York State Parks, and myself and other folks in our Parks Planning Bureau will be leading this effort for the 2020 Greenways plan.
Good morning, everyone. This is Tana Bigelow. I'm a planner with New York State Parks based in Albany, and I'm working on developing the Greenways trail plan with Chris.
Hi, this is Nancy Stoner. I'm an environmental analyst with New York State Parks, and I will be focused on the environmental review of the plan.
Thanks, Tana and Nancy. So I'm just going to briefly go over the agenda for today's presentation and then talk about a couple housekeeping notes. Just quickly, if anyone's having trouble hearing or seeing, send us a message in the chat. That'll be the best way to communicate with us while we're jumping back and forth between slides. Everybody should be muted, and then when we get to the question and answer period, we'll unmute. So again, to quickly go over the agenda. First, we're going to talk briefly about the background and the plan's purpose and requirements. We'll then discuss the draft scoping document and its role in the planning process. And then we'll walk through the content of the scoping document and the plan sections. Lastly, we'll discuss the options that are available to submit public comment and input on the scoping document and plan. And then we'll open it up to questions. A couple housekeeping items to mention. In order to keep to our time frame, we're going to be about 30 minutes here with us speaking before we get to the question and answers, and allow for enough question time. We'll ask that you hold all questions and things like that until we reach the end of the session. I also want to mention that the webinar is being recorded. It'll be made available on our website for those that weren't able to join us live. And another note on that, when we get to the question and answer portion of the agenda, if you're not comfortable saying your name for the recording, again, it'll be up on the web. You can omit your name if you'd prefer. So first, a little background. The New York State Office of Parks and Recreation and Historic Preservation is the state agency designated to develop statewide trail planning documents for New York, such as the 2020 statewide Greenways plan that we're going to be discussing. The agency has produced previous statewide trails plans, the most recent one being in 2010. Prior to that, there was a 1994 plan, and in doing some background research leading up to this, I also found a 1969 trails plan as well in our library. One of the main differences to note is that the 2010 trails plan addressed all various types of trails across the state, such as long distance hiking trails, greenways trails, water trails. It even touched on ATV and motorized trails as well. The 2020 Greenways plan will more directly address those greenway trail types and the uses that occur on those trails. We'll touch on what a greenways trail is defined as in just a little bit in a couple of slides. So what led to us developing this 2020 Greenways plan? In 2019, lawmakers passed the legislation, which was then signed by the governor, that directs state parks to create this Greenways Trails Plan. You can see up there, the Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation shall create a plan for a comprehensive statewide system of non-motorized multi-use trails. And you can continue reading. So in simple terms, it's a statewide trails plan of integrated non-motorized trails designed for multiple uses, or what we're calling greenway trails. So why this plan? Why now? One of the reasons we've heard from folks, especially our partners at Parks and Trails New York, who were kind of on the ground getting, organizing for that legislation when it was being drafted. The goal of this plan was to harness the momentum that is going on right now with the Empire State Trail, the governor's initiative to, put lots of capital funds into completing sections of the gaps in the Erie Canalway Trail, gaps in various Hudson Valley trails, and then extend that trail network north to Canada as well. So this plan, having this plan in place would help continue to advance those types of trail efforts across the state. And really, when some of those build-out sections are completed in 2020, this plan will be kind of the next big step in moving trails forward for New York State. So the law directing parks to produce this plan identifies some components and requirements, and those include consultation with state-level agency partners, including the Department of Environmental Conservation, New York State Department of Transportation, the Department of Health, and a number of others. Our planning team will also be collaborating with other partners in creating this plan, like New York State Canal Corporation, folks from the Empire State Trail, the Hudson and Niagara River Valley Greenways, and other various stakeholders from across the state that are involved in regional on-the-ground efforts for trail planning, management, things like that. The law calls for a vision for the statewide trails network. Todd will touch a little bit later on that, of what that vision will contain. The law also asks for a GIS inventory to be created of existing, planned, and proposed trails across the state. OPRHP, our agency, has an existing inventory that was used and compiled for the 2010 Trails Plan, and it was updated in 2015. We'll be updating that for this plan with, new sections of trail that have been constructed in the last 5-10 years, other trails that have been planned, done feasibility studies on, and trail proposals, so that we have the most up-to-date data set that we can provide alongside this plan. The law also calls for recommendations on development of trails, trail signage, funding, and more. And lastly, the law requires a draft plan to be prepared in 1 year from the date signed into law, and we're aiming for that in November 2020. I'm going to pass it to Nancy now to discuss the scoping document for the plan and the requirements for environmental review.
Thanks, Chris. So under the State Environmental Quality Review Act, or SEQR, the action here is the adoption and implementation of the Statewide Greenways Plan, GEIS. This was deemed as a Type 1 action under SEQR, being considered a comprehensive plan. State Parks completed a full environmental assessment form. And since the plan is statewide and is expected to have wide application, it was deemed appropriate to prepare a generic environmental impact statement, or GEIS, to assess the environmental impacts of the proposed action. Positive declaration and the draft scoping document were both published on April 22nd of this year. And part of the process of developing the Greenways Plan, GEIS, is to define the scope of the document. The scoping is the process by which the issues to be addressed in the GEIS are identified, and to ensure that the draft GEIS will be a concise, accurate, and complete document adequate for public review. Scoping is also the first opportunity for public participation in the review process. It allows the community and interested stakeholders to be made aware of the proposed plan and to identify topics and concerns of interest for potential inclusion in the document. So comments on the draft scoping document will be received until May 31st. And comments received during this public comment period will be considered during the preparation of the final scoping document. And then that sets the stage for the draft plan, DGIS development. The plan and DGIS will be published in November, as Chris said. And after its publication, it will be made available for public and agency review and comment for a minimum of 60 days. And during that comment period, we will hold a public hearing to receive comments. And then a final plan will be produced next year, incorporating substantive comments received. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Nancy. One thing I wanted to mention as well, you'll see at the top of this slide a link to where that draft scoping document and draft generic environmental impact statement is located on our website. That link appears throughout the presentation, and we aren't going into fine detail on each component of that draft scoping document, but we're going to touch on the highlights. If you really want to read it, it's not a long document. I encourage you to go to the website and take a look and review it. And then you'll be able to provide comment as well. So now we're going to walk through the sections of the draft scoping document and discuss the components that will be included in the Greenways plan. We aren't able to do a deep dive into all the sections of the scoping document like I mentioned, but I encourage you to take a few minutes and review it on your own. Again, the link is provided throughout below here and then at the end. So first, let's start by defining the types of trails that will be included as Greenway trails for the plan. In the draft scoping document, we've defined Greenway trails as trails designed for multiple uses that can be broadly described as shared use paths like rail trails, bike paths, canal trails, recreation ways, community trails, and others. These are those more developed trails. You think I think the picture does a great job of describing it. The little bit wider, developed surface on the trail in that corridor, providing some connectivity, provides opportunities for both recreation and transportation. I think we can all think of examples: Erie Canalway Trail, Dutchess County Rail Trail, the Empire State Trail is a good example. The Genesee Valley Greenway, even down to the Hudson River Trail in Manhattan and more. Again, trails that provide local, regional connectivity and used for both recreation and transportation. So the plan will also discuss the various trail user groups on Greenways, such as pedestrians, cyclists, runners, and winter activities, even cross-country skiing and other activities, maybe in some trails such as equestrian use. The plan will not discuss trails such as long-distance hiking trails, water trails, or multiple-use trails that are more, let's say, backcountry or contained within a specific park, or shorter distance or lack connectivity. Again, that was much more included in the 2010 plan, and this is a much more focused plan on those Greenway-type trails. I'm going to hand it to Tana now to talk about the next sections of the plan.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So we're going to take a look at some of the content in a little more detail here. The scoping document, first of all, describes what's involved in developing the plan. And one of the major components of that is the public survey that we now have active, and we'll provide you with the link later in the webinar. If you haven't taken the public survey yet, I would encourage you to do so. We're also going to be getting input from state agencies and regional stakeholders, including, as Chris said, representatives from the Department of Health, the Canal Corp, Department of Transportation, Park Service, and a pretty good number of others. Plan content is going to be based on research. We're going to look at current studies, articles, data, and see how existing trail systems have been developed, how they're managed and maintained, and how trails planning is happening in other states. The plan will identify issues related to Greenway trails today, and as we anticipate, there'll be issues that'll be coming up in the future. It'll identify public demand, and we'll look for trends in the development and use of Greenway trails in the 21st century. So this, next slide, please. Thank you. This plan is being developed at a time when, as everyone knows, the world is changing very rapidly. The plan's going to take a look at how Greenway trails will need to adapt and function to accommodate current and anticipated changes. The content of the plan is going to be based on different resources including what we learned from the public stakeholder meetings and other outreach and collaboration. We'll look at what is the demand, is there a desire for more, and what are the priority issues that users have. The plan is going to look at regional variables, urban and rural concerns, and differences and shifts in usage. It'll ask how these trails may be impacted by climate change and how do we think we'll address these impacts. Findings will be supported with documentation, which may include spatial data, maps and charts, and published articles, reports, and studies. Next slide, please. So part of the planning process will be to develop a vision for a statewide network, as Chris said. We're going to think about non-motorized primary corridors in the state, excuse me, and in order to help shape the scope and the character and the purpose, the function of our Greenway Trail system, we're going to try to determine a vision for what the system should be. The plan will include goals for geographic distribution of greenways, goals for universal accessibility, and general goals for new trail acquisition and development. And now I will pass it back to Nancy.
Thank you. So the environmental impacts chapter of the GEIS will describe the environmental setting, which is basically the state of New York, its people and resources, the alternatives, and because this is a statewide plan, we have the no action alternatives and the adoption and implementation of the plan. Discuss potential environmental impacts and mitigation measures for implementation of the plan. We've identified resource categories that are likely to be impacted from the proposed action, such as land, water, biological resources, and also identified some resource categories that are unlikely to be impacted. Since this is a generic environmental impact statement, impacts will be discussed in a general fashion after the plan has been adopted, and as specific projects are implemented across the state, those projects will undergo seeker review at the local level. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks. So as I mentioned, there are a number of ways that we'll be collecting public input for the plan, as well as input on and comments on the draft scoping document. At the top, I've provided the link again to the draft scoping document where you can read a copy for yourself and download it. Comments on the draft scoping document are due by May 31st and can be sent to the email address shown, statewide-trails-plan@parks.ny.gov. General plan comments can also be sent to this email at any point, but comments related to the draft scoping document need to be received by May 31st. As Tana mentioned earlier, we've partnered with Parks and Trails New York to assist us in collecting public input for the plan by way of a public survey. The survey can be found at the website listed here, greenwaysplan.org, and we'll be accepting responses through the end of June. And this survey is, really designed to capture that public input, whether they're current trail users, potential trail users, stakeholders, and we've got a really great response so far. We hope to continue that going forward, and that data will help inform the plans, sections, needs and trends, current uses, things like that. We encourage you to share your input through the survey, and if possible, consider sharing the survey through your networks as well. If you're part of a friends group or, have an interest in trail advocacy, we can use more input. Lastly, as I mentioned earlier, we expect a draft of the plan to be available in November, and as Nancy said, at that time there'll be a 60-day comment period as well as a public hearing on the draft plan, so there'll be opportunity to comment at that time as well. These links will appear later as well. So with that, we're going to move into questions on the draft scoping document and the plan in general. I'd ask that you please keep your microphones muted if you're not speaking so we can clearly hear the person that is speaking. And if you'd like also, we can use the chat feature. I have that window up if you're not able to send your question clearly or you'd rather type it out. If we aren't able to get to certain questions or they appear in the chat, we'll be sure to follow up with you if you've identified yourself to answer those. And you can also go to the statewide trails plan email that's listed. So with that, let's move into questions. Feel free to unmute yourselves and or enter a question into the chat.
Hi, Harvey Botsman. I don't know if, can you hear me?
Hi, Harvey. Yes, we can.
Okay. One of the big problems with bicycling, and I represent the New York Bicycling Coalition, among other organizations, is that the electric bicycles, electric assist bicycles, and I'm specifying assist bicycles, would be banned under the general law here. And I think that has to be put in there. This is a growing category of bicycles for both people who are older and as well as disabled people, if that's the correct term these days. So I think that even the scoping document has to discuss that to some extent.
Great. So yeah, e-bikes will definitely be a component of the plan when we talk about uses. And I know that behind the scenes, there's quite a bit of discussion going on with parks now that the law has changed with the budget passing for e-bikes. A lot of discussion going on Parks End about, you know, where certain classes of bikes will be allowed and maybe where they won't be allowed as well. I know we're going to be coordinating with folks from the Empire State Trail, Canal Corporation as well. You know, when you think about that connectivity across different trail networks, we want to make sure that there's agreement and similarity in what's being allowed so that people can travel. So thanks for bringing that up, Harvey.
You're welcome.
Hello, this is Jay Lambrix from Tompkins County. Hello.
Hi, Jay, thanks.
Hi. So what I'm seeing here, and what I'm seeing in a lot of other initiatives, is very much a focus on recreational cycling, bicycle tourism, that sort of thing. But I think there's a real opportunity with this plan to kind of find a sweet spot between recreational and utilitarian cycling in cities and towns, because here in Tompkins County, we have a great number of greenway trails, but the problem is it's hard for people who are living in the city who want to bike to access these trails, and people who are coming into town on the trails to access other trails on the other side of town, because we do not have really great connectivity within the city limits. So I'm just wondering, is there any funding being discussed as to how to connect people in cities to these greenways? People come in, and then as soon as they hit the city, they don't feel safe.
Sure. So I think that the connectivity between, you know, more urban, let's say, you know, cycling or trail opportunities, some of those street level connections, and, you know, an external trail network will be discussed. Specific to funding, you know, we're going to be able to list the variety of funding opportunities that are available for these type of trails in the plan. And so we can certainly look at, you know, where that crossover lies between, you know, trail specific funding. A lot of times those more urban connection funding sources are transportation based, so we'll certainly be addressing those as well.
Yeah, because the way things are right now, like if people want to come into downtown on any kind of protected infrastructure, they have to take about a 25 to 30-minute detour north and then come all the way back down south to downtown, where they stop, they get drinks, they eat, they shop. And whereas if they had a direct connection from the trail, it would take about 5 minutes. It's just, I think those types of economic opportunities need to be kept in mind going forward. Just food for thought.
Thanks, Jay.
This is Harvey Botsman again. I have one. I'll make written comments, but one of the more important things is who's going to maintain these trails, and it's always been a problem. For instance, on the Erie Canalway Trail, that there's a question of who maintains it. It's the Canal Corporation, the municipality, the state, and I think that within even the scoping document. It should be written in somewhere that contracts have to be made or to define who will be maintaining the trail, both in the wintertime, if they're going to be plowing, or in the general year-round time it's going to be used.
Thanks, Harvey. So I think to be clear, the scoping document will have a deeper dive into those specific components and kind of recommendations. The scoping document can certainly mention that maintenance and operations and maintenance will be a component of that the plan should discuss. So we'll definitely have that as something to include. So is any other questions out there as far as maybe the GIS inventory, the data collection, existing plan, proposed trails, maybe try and spur a little conversation with that, or does anybody have any additional questions on kind of the process for the scoping document or, next steps from here?
Will there be cameras on some of these greenways just for counting purposes? This is always a problem to determine how many people are using these various trail, whether it's a municipal trail or it's a statewide trail like the Genesee Greenway or even the Canalway Trail. So there should be something in the scoping document about regular counts of any trail.
So at this time, we don't have an expectation to have associated trail counts specific to this plan. The plan is statewide, and a lot of times those counts are specific regionally, or I know when we did an effort in 2015, we had a number of different trails across the state we did as kind of a sample to do those counts on. I think what we'll be able to do in this plan is to use some of, Parks and Trails New York or other data collection efforts. I know that Capital District Transportation Committee with their most recent trails plan had a really robust trail count as well. So use some of that data to roll up into what proposed use numbers look like. I know there was a study done as well with the Empire State Trail when they did some use projections. So that'll certainly be a component. But again, we don't foresee us undertaking any specific trail counts in association with this plan. Right now, the effort is really to collect the spatial data and display that as kind of the first step. And I should mention too, we're really hopeful to be able to put this data up online around the time, hopefully, of the draft plan. We expect to have kind of like a public wiki map, let's say, so that folks can go explore the data a little bit more, provide some comments specifically, maybe on a trail that they're familiar with. If we didn't quite get the data right, we can make some changes behind the scenes and display it more appropriately. As well, too, for planned and proposed trails, if people have trails in their region that they're familiar with, that we can include. We're definitely interested in that.
Hi, Chris. This is Kevin Smith with Woodstock Land Conservancy in Woodstock, New York.
Hi, Kevin.
Hi. Yeah, regarding that last comment you just made, our organization's been involved with Ulster County, and Chris White, the project manager and deputy director of planning for the Ashokan Rail Trail, which opened in October of 2019, is on the call, I think. And we were one of the partner organizations with the county and New York City DEP on the Ashokan, which has had incredible usage just in the first 6 months since it opened. We're also involved in partnership with Open Space Institute and New York State DEC right across Route 28 in the Catskill Park corridor at the Bluestone Wild Forest. And there's potential connectivity there that we're exploring to connect the expanded multi-use trail network that is now just by the as of the end of 2019, 28 miles of connected trails, some of which is optimized for mountain biking. It's hiking, cross-country skiing, you know, et cetera, but some of it is optimized for mountain biking. And how does that fit into this plan? In my reading of it, is that the kind of thing that would be kind of a secondary or a second tier connected part of a connected trail ecosystem to a wider shared use trail like the Ashokan?
Yeah, so for this plan, the Ashokan is, you know, the bread and butter of the plan. I mean, that trail in and of itself is a great example, and I very much want to use that trail as a potential case study, or, you know, kind of a highlight with some just kind of a call out in the plan. You know, I think the different partnerships that came together to make a successful trail there, you know, could be a great example across the state that people can use. So the connection, I'm actually very familiar with the area you're talking about. So the connection to Bluestone, you know, that connection, depending on the maybe describe what the planned characteristics of that trail would be, would potentially be included in this plan. The trail network in Bluestone and Onteora, in those state forest areas, we wouldn't be including that data in our map or, you know, that trail network in the descriptive pieces of this plan. But, you know, the opportunities to connect from a rail trail corridor over to another recreation destination are part of that. And, you know, on the south and east end of the trail too, you know, the opportunities that lead down into some of the other trail networks and the, again, planned or, you know, on the ground trail networks down in Kingston are a good example of what would be included.
Thank you. That's very helpful, including the last part of your response, because as you know, the Route 28 is the most heavily used corridor to access the Catskill Park. Thank you.
Yes, I know it well. I was actually down there trying to pull out the other day when it was I feel like everybody's heading up there on nice days. So it is busy. So if folks have a last few minutes, give you an opportunity to think of some questions, send them into the chat. Otherwise, we can leave the links on the page and just wrap things up. All right, so if there's no more questions, my screen went, there we go. I'll just say thank you for joining us today for the public information session. There are links and how you can participate up on the screen. And if you have any more questions, you can email that Statewide Trails Plan email address for more information. My email address is also listed in the scoping document and that you can find on the master plans page. And please go participate in our public survey with Parks and Trails New York. Appreciate y'all being here, and we hope you have a good rest of your day. I'll leave the screen up for a few minutes while people are signing off so they can copy down their links and email addresses. Thanks again.
Thank you so much for your work.
Thank you.
Thank you.